Yesterday, Doug Ford's BC party won another majority government in Ontario. We're going to take a look at that from a climate and environmental perspective with Professor Mark Winfield of York University. So, welcome to the interview, Mark.
Afternoon, Markham.
Now, there were a lot of surprised people across Canada who didn't think Doug Ford would do quite as well. And what's your general take on the election?
It's a disappointing, if not surprising, outcome. This was, I think, clear in terms of where things were going over the last week. What is surprising is that there was quite a lot of coverage of environmental issues during the campaign and in the run-up and on the Ford government's agenda and record. And that seems to have had pretty much no impact at all in terms of the outcome of the election. It didn't really register. All three major opposition parties put quite substantial platforms on the table in terms of climate and the environment. And again, did not seem to find very much traction at all. Now, whether this is a product of voters just being disengaged completely is unclear. We seem to have hit a new historic low in voter turnout in Ontario. So that is part of the mix as well. Is this really just a case of disengagement?
And I understand that there's Ontario voters take a different view of climate and the environment depending on whether they're talking about the provincial context or the federal context.
This seems to be emerging that when looking at these issues through a federal lens, you get quite strong responses from Ontario voters. The issue tends to be ranked very, very high up. And you saw that in the outcome of last fall's federal election, that the parties committing to substantial action on climate change racked up 85 seats in Ontario. The Conservatives got 37. But when you ask the same questions in a provincial context in Ontario, you get very, very different answers. And you get environment and climate change maybe ranking 5th, 6th, even 7th on a list of voters' priorities. So Ontario voters do seem to be looking at this issue through two quite different lenses, depending on whether we're talking about the federal government or the provincial government.
Now, speaking of federal climate policy in particular, the Ford government and the Trudeau Liberals seem to be on a collision course here because the Liberals have brought in ever stricter environmental climate targets and climate policy. And there are some policies like, clean power grid by 2035, those sorts of things, where the Ford government is going in the opposite direction. And so are we going to see at some point a major clash between the Ontario government and the federal government?
Well, I think this is a big question now. So far, the federal government has given the Ford government something of a free ride on climate issues. They effectively have let them off the hook on the industrial greenhouse gas emissions requirements, have allowed an exemption on the basis of a much weaker Ontario provision. There has been silence on the question of the fact the province is on track to a 600% increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector. The federal government sort of had to be dragged kicking and screaming into conducting a federal environmental assessment of the 413 highway project and declined to do one on its evil twin, the Bradford bypass, even though in some ways the federal implications of that project are even bigger. So far, as I say, it's been a bit of a free ride for Doug Ford. One has to wonder, is that going to change? Indeed, I think it has to change if we're going to make any progress on environmental issues and particularly climate in Ontario. There is historical precedent for that. Part of the reason the coal phase out happened in Ontario was that the federal government at the time, particularly David Anderson, who was the federal environment minister at the time, signed a treaty with the United States called the Ozone Annex, which committed Canada to reducing smog emissions, and then said we are prepared to regulate those emissions in Ontario if we have to. So there is precedent for this, but we now have to wait and see. Does the federal government sort of read the polls the same way I am in terms of how voters look at it acting on environmental and climate change issues versus what they seem to expect from their provincial government?
Are we likely to see Doug Ford take a more belligerent approach to the federal government, as something akin to Jason Kenney in Alberta? And I'm thinking around, the big fight they had over the carbon tax, where Ford I remember his rhetoric was a little inflammatory, though of course not as inflammatory as Kenney's, but nevertheless. But then other times, Ford seems to do a little bit of a rope-a-dope. He likes to, he doesn't want to do what the federal government wants him to do, but he tries to avoid direct conflict. Am I reading that correctly?
That seems to be the case. I mean, the two levels of government seem to have what I think might be best described as a functional relationship. And both seem so far to have an interest in maintaining that, partially because there are federal dollars flowing to Ontario. How this gets approached, particularly if the federal government becomes more assertive around climate, is an interesting question. At the end of the day, I mean, Mr. Ford's mandate here, although he has a strong majority in the legislature, is thinner than it might look initially. If you think about voter turnout in the range of 43%, and then about 40% of the popular vote in the election, that means only about 18% of Ontario voters actually voted for the government. So the mandate here is not an overwhelming one. So there is sort of a sign of caution there. There have been signs of willingness to work together. Obviously, the big investments in electric vehicle manufacturing have been a big one. So there's some, and in steel as well. So there have been movements at a sectoral level. So I think this is going to be an interesting one to see. But at the end of the day, if we're going to get anywhere on climate at a national level, Ontario is going to have to move or be moved to get there. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch now how this dynamic plays out, because both sides, in a sense, can lay claim to a political mandate of one form or another. The federal government clearly reelected on the basis of its commitments around climate, among other things, very strongly in Ontario. And then Mr. Ford, though, has his new mandate, which is about get it done, but getting it done is not climate change.
So we know that there's going to be some conflict around the electricity system. The number of nuclear plants are going off. 3 plants over the 2020s are going to go offline, and Ontario plans to ramp up natural gas power production, which will increase greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be a point of conflict. Are there one or two other really obvious issues where the federal government and the Ontario government could clash?
There are actually several. As you say, the electricity question is perhaps the most obvious, because there is a direct collision between the pathway that the Ontario electricity sector is on, which is towards a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions, versus the federal commitment to a net zero grid by 2035. Now, interestingly, during the debate, Mr. Ford said he's for 100% emission free, but we don't see any plan for that. Two other areas where there could be significant conflict. One is the Ring of Fire mineral development in Northern Ontario, which the provincial government has sort of made part of its critical mineral strategy around EV battery manufacturing. But of course, there is a federal regional environmental assessment happening in that area of Ontario, particularly because of the impacts and Indigenous issues. There is also a very large question, given that the boreal region in Ontario is, of course, part of one of the major global carbon sinks. And the implications of some major industrial development in that area from a climate perspective, I don't think have been thought about at all so far. The other one where there's a potential collision is during the election campaign. The 413 highway, which runs sort of north of Toronto, became a major point of division between Mr. Ford and all of the opposition parties. it is subject to a federal environmental assessment and indeed could not proceed without certain federal approvals. So that could be another area of significant collision between the Ford government and the Trudeau Liberals in Ottawa.
Well, we'll look forward to see how that plays out. Mark, thank you very much. I always appreciate your insights.
Great, thank you.